Healthcare is too expensive. Employers are offsetting costs onto their employees. Who will make health benefits affordable for hardworking Americans and their families? You will. This is the Empowering Plans Podcast, a show dedicated to helping you once again emphasize the benefit in benefit plan. Now prepare to learn, plan, save, and protect with the FIA Group.
Welcome, everyone, to the latest edition of the Empowering Plans podcast. My name is Corey Crigger, and with me, as always, Nicholas Bonds. Nick, how are you?
Hi, Corey. Doing well. How are you, man?
I'm doing fantastic. Thank you so much for asking. For those who don't know, or maybe this is the first time that they've logged in to listen to the Nick and Corey edition of the podcast, Nick is reigning from Houston, Texas, and the cultural event of the decade just landed in Houston, Texas over the past weekend. Taylor Swift playing NRG Stadium. Nick, did you go? Did you survive? Are the Swifties still there?
Yeah, Corey, we mostly escaped Hurricane Taylor unscathed. Just took down the boards over our windows today. Everything looks like it's okay. We didn't lose power or anything crazy like that. But yeah, it was crazy how many people, like so many of my friends from high school that I check on once every 10 years. We're all lighting up social media with their T-Swift merch and their 13s painted on the backs of their hands. And it really took over the town for a minute there. It was kind of wild. I hear you're a bit of a Swiftie yourself, sir.
Absolutely. I have tickets to the June 30th show. I am not here to poke the Taylor Swift fan base. They will dox you. So I'm not here to make fun of anyone who's a Taylor Swift fan because I am one. I would continue to fill up our 30 minutes talking about Taylor Swift, but I'm not 100% sure FIA would approve of that. They do bring us here to talk about industry-related topics, which we have in store for you today. Just to set the scene a little bit, I'm going to spend some time talking about a little known piece of legislation. You probably haven't heard about this. This is probably going to be the first time you've heard about something called the No Surprises Act. We'll talk about that, and then I'm going to hand it off to Nick, who's going to talk about some ACA preventative care. And as time allows, maybe we'll hit a couple of current event topics. The funny thing is, Nick, is I think we're at a perfect place to kind of talk about the NSA because we're long enough into the law being in effect that we can kind of look back at where we've been, see where we are today, and then where do we think we're going? And I think we're at a really good point to talk about that. So I'm going to kind of walk us through the first 18 months, that what we've seen, major milestones, what we're seeing today, and what I think we're going to see in the future. So let's get started. And of course, this is something that has been talked about multiple times, but it's so important. It's impacting so many of our clients. I think that it really can't be talked about enough. So let's hop in the DeLorean. Let's go in the Wayback Machine. Let's go back to 1/1/22. That's when the NSA went into effect, right? Date of services after that, patients are now going to be protected as long as their claim falls under the purview of the No Surprise Act. And that can either be an out-of-network emergency claim, an air ambulance, or receiving out-of-network services at an in-network facility, right? Those are your buckets. Less than 40 days after it went into effect in February of 22, portions of the No Surprise Act were challenged by Texas Medical Association. They're going to be a reoccurring player here, right? So I'm going to abbreviate that as TMA. TMA, they challenged the qualified payment amount provision in the final rules proposed by CMS. And they basically said that in the original iteration, right when the NSA went to it in effect back last year, there was a rebuttable presumption that the QPA was the right amount, and that should be the amount that should be selected by the IDR entity. So when the provider and the health plan has a dispute and they submit their two separate amounts for IDR determination, the IDR entity should choose the amount closest to the QPA because there was a rebuttable presumption that the QPA was the correct amount that should be paid for services. TMA challenged that. They said, one, that the Department of Health and Human Services were overstepping their delegated congressional authority with that rule, and two, that it gave an unfair advantage to health plans in this scenario. And the Texas District Court and Judge Kernodle upheld that. They said that TMA was absolutely right, that there was undue weight given to the QPA and it was an unfair advantage for health plans. So we're going to fast forward to August of 22, and a final rule is now issued in which CMS and the Department of Health and Human Services have cleaned up the language. And they have now decided to say that instead of there being a rebuttable presumption around the QPA, the IDR entities should consider first the QPA and then other factors as defined by the No Surprises Act. Those other factors being case acuity, being fair market value for services rendered, quality of the provider, all those other factors. So first the QPA and then the other factors. That's going to come into play just a little bit later. So put a pin in that. By November of 22, there are 90,000 claims in the IDR process at some point, way more than what was projected. Later in November 22, TMA files another lawsuit saying that the new definition, saying consider the QPA first, then all other factors, has created a de facto primary factor in the QPA, and that all their same arguments for the first lawsuit are still true today. Unfair advantage to the health plan. The QPA is given more weight than what Congress meant to give the QPA. TMA then files two more lawsuits before the end of January 23, one dealing with the QPA is artificially being deflated by aspects of the final rules, and a fourth suit challenging the 600% rate hike in the administrative fees. February 23. Same district court, same judge rules in favor of TMA again, saying you're absolutely right. The final rule still is giving unfair weight to the QPA. Middle of February, CMS puts a hold on all payment determinations from IDR entities. Finally, by the end of February, CMS says IDR entities can resume payment determinations for services prior to 10/25/22. Middle of March 23, new rules are issued. The QPA and all factors are considered in the same sentence. And as of recording of this podcast, it has not been challenged, and that is the valid rule that is in play. And there are, I believe I read today, 140,000 claims in the IDR payment determination process. Again, just flooded this system. So that's kind of where we are today, right? Where we come from, where we are today. What are the biggest issues that we're seeing, right? What do we see?
Corey, you were mentioning there was the hold by CMS on payment determinations. That's now lifted, but is that only for services prior to the October changes?
Great question, Nick. So I actually got a IDR fee request for a claim that incurred after that 10/25/22 data service. I got that earlier this week. So the hold is lifted. Seems like everything is running through the normal process as they work through that backlog. Great question. Thank you for pointing that out. Yeah, so fee requests are coming out for dates of service and payment determinations initiated after that October 25th deadline.
Sounds like that backlog just keeps growing.
Absolutely. And you know what? Why don't we start there with the biggest issues that we're seeing, right? The sheer volume of claims being submitted right now. It is far more than what predictions were estimating. And the hike in the fee for admin fees is a result of the amount of claims being submitted. And the idea behind that is that there were a lot of low dollar claims being forced into the IDR process from either the provider or the health plan side. So why not raise those admin fees to try to be a deterrent for low dollar claims in which health plans and providers should be able to get their heads together and come up with a fair amount for services rendered without flooding the process, right?
That's the yardstick outside of the IDR roller coaster ride. You must be willing to pay this much to ride this IDR ride, it sounds like.
Absolutely. And there's actually two fees. There's the fee for the CMS fee, admin fee, and then the fee to the IDR entity itself. And the fee to the IDR entity is to make up for the fact that there's so many claims going into the IDR. And just to conceptualize it and put some numbers in, the fee request that I received just earlier this week, it's going to be $1,000. It's going to be $1,000 when you add the CMS fee and the IDR fee together. So if you're talking about a claim where the dispute is $2,000, is $1,000 for an IDR fee going to be worth it? Is a claim where the dispute is $5,000 worth $1,000 just to get your foot in the door? I think the department is hoping that we can back some of that off and get the volume down. And then the other biggest thing that I would say that we're seeing, at least from our client standpoint, is the disclosures that are required. This is still a process in which provider side and plan side are working through best practices, either internally or mechanically and operationally within their organizations. And one of those things that we tell a lot of clients, hey, your EOBs for your NSA claims, they don't have the proper disclosures. For sake of time, I'm going to just say it's super high level. If you have questions about the disclosures, please reach out to our consulting team or Nick will be able to fill these questions. But basically, who do I contact about open negotiations, and is this an NSA claim? That's the 20,000 foot view. You got to make sure that you have the proper disclosures on there. What do we see moving forward, right? That's the last thing before I hand it off and I let Nick take over for a little bit. You know what? The biggest thing that we're seeing and projecting forward is, to quote Jack Sparrow, these timelines, they're more than guidelines than rules right now, right? We see providers missing guidelines. We got a request in from a client in which the provider was completely wrong about the filing deadlines and the applicability of the NSA, and they still pushed it into the IDR process. We were able to help our client navigate those waters. We got the fees that our client paid refunded. We were able to get that back on the rails. But you have sophisticated actors on both sides trying to figure out how to navigate in these waters, right? And then we are also seeing, from our client side, we're getting balance bill referrals, like standard balance bills from our normal RBP clients. And when we take another look at them, we're saying, wait a minute, this is NSA applicability, and this may have been missed by our own client. And we're asking the questions that should have been asked on the front end to say, hey, did you guys do a No Surprise Act analysis on this claim? Because this is what we're seeing. Don't you agree? And upon second review of this, oh yeah, absolutely right. This is an NSA claim. So I would say this, that if you're listening to this podcast right now and you're unsure about the No Surprises Act, I think the biggest thing that I would tell you is you're not alone. You're not alone, but you have access to good resources. FIA can help you navigate these waters as they change, as they morph, as we move forward. I think that it's going to be another year of gathering information. We're already starting to see that certain IDR entities favor providers while other IDR entities favor plans. We're starting to see trends.
That was inevitable that some IDR entities, we'd see them be a little more provider friendly, some would be a little more plan friendly, and everybody's still gaming that out, I'm sure.
Absolutely right. So if you have an NSA question, you're out there, you're listening to this, you have an NSA question, reach out to FIA. We'll be able to plug you in, get an answer that fits your situation, and be able to either help yourself or help your clients during this time. So with all that being said, I talked a lot. One might say, Nick, that I prevented you from being able to jump in and provide any content in the first half of this podcast. So I'm going to hand it off to you, and I'm going to let you talk about what are we hearing now?
Well, before you mandate where I go next in the podcast, I did have one question I wanted to ask you about the NSA. Really, just in your experience, are you seeing clients when they enter the IDR process, are they keeping up negotiating directly with the provider while that's happening, or are they handling everything through the IDR entity?
Yeah, so the claim that I'm handling, we actually negotiated all the way through while the IDR pause was intact and while the IDR entity was being selected, and we came to a settlement amount prior to having to submit offers to the IDR entity. I believe that if you read the No Surprise Act, that's keeping within the spirit of the NSA. It is open communication between provider and plan, keeping the patient out of it, and it is to work towards a result that is what are fair market value for these services rendered. It's not your billed charges. Maybe it's not your plan benefits. You guys work together to see what happens. So there is no bar to negotiating through the IDR process. I would encourage people to keep that line of communication open, because at the end of the day, it's the same thing if you take a personal injury case to trial, right, Nick? At some point, it's going to be out of your hands, and a guaranteed decent result might be better than rolling the dice and having a catastrophic result be able to come on top from the IDR entity. So great question there.
Yeah, thanks. I thought I'd put you on the spot with that one, but you batted it out of the park, Corey.
Absolutely,
Well,
like I always did.
Like always, like always. So turning to what Corey was alluding to there, on my end, I wanted to kind of go through this other lawsuit that sprang out of Texas naturally, challenging the ACA's preventive care mandate. It actually kind of did that on similar terms to what the TMA that Corey was bringing up was trying to challenge the No Surprises Act requirements, essentially arguing that the law itself and the requirement thereunder went beyond the scope of the authority that was delegated or that could properly be delegated under the Constitution. So what am I talking about here? Really, the preventive care mandate, we're all pretty well familiar with, but essentially it just requires that group health plans have to provide certain preventive services without implementing any kind of cost sharing. That can be things like immunizations, certain screenings, testing. It will vary a bit based on a person's age, based on their gender. Like newborns will need certain blood screenings as they get older. A vision screening would be appropriate preventive care. Things like birth control, depression screenings, screenings for diseases like HIV, hepatitis, cancer screening. That's all part of the sort of evolving spectrum of preventive care as people go through their lives. The way that those types of care are determined stems from a group of kind of government-appointed panels. The big ones are the United States Preventive Services Task Force, the USPSTF, which I always have to say exactly like that or I get tongue-tied, the USPSTF. Any services they recommend with an A rating or a B rating generally have to be covered pursuant to the ACA's preventive care mandate. There's a few other agencies like the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, ACIP. They recommend immunizations. There's also additional preventive care for women and children that might be recommended by the Health Resources and Services Recommendation, the HRSA. The ones that are kind of under the gun are this not new, but this recently updated lawsuit, Braidwood Management Inc. v. Becerra. The ones under the gun here really are the USPSTF. Essentially, a group of Texas plaintiffs brought suit challenging the preventive care mandate under the Appointments Clause of the Constitution, which is kind of a rare one to see, but essentially they argued that members of USPSTF, ACIP, and HRSA were assuming authority as officers of the United States, but they weren't being properly appointed. So essentially, the Appointments Clause requires certain officers of the United States to get approval and consent from the Senate. Think like a cabinet secretary or like a Supreme Court justice. The president appoints them with the advice and consent of the Senate, so it would have to go through a hearing and a vote. It would be a really big deal. Currently, the people who run those organizations aren't appointed that way. They're essentially appointed by the Secretary of HHS, which is why that lawsuit names Secretary Becerra. They had a few other arguments that were interesting. They tried to argue the non-delegation doctrine, and they had another argument under the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which is a pretty common way. We've seen a lot of people trying to challenge the ACA. So this case went before Judge Reed O'Connor here in Texas, who may be a familiar name to anybody who's seen some of the other challenges to the ACA. I'm not sure if it was last year or the year before now. Time has lost all meaning, but he was the judge that essentially tried to throw out the entire ACA in a lawsuit. He essentially held that the ACA itself was broadly unconstitutional, and that was really threatening to shake up our industry pretty heavily until the Supreme Court kind of batted that down. But he essentially took those three arguments and saw merit in the Appointments Clause arguments and in the Religious Freedom Restoration Act argument. He sort of threw out their second argument there. But essentially, he found that the USPSTF were essentially exceeding their duly appointed authority under the Constitution. The other groups he largely said were okay where they're at, but the USPSTF, because their recommendations were, I think, a bit broader in scope, that they were basically doing more than they should have been allowed to do, which means that he essentially threw out all of the USPSTF's recommendations since the ACA took effect back in 2010. So anything that falls under the Preventive Care Services mandate based on being an A or B recommendation from the USPSTF since 2010 would no longer be enforceable under the Preventive Care mandate. That includes a lot of things that could affect potentially a lot of people. So the potential impact of that is very broad. Essentially, fully insured plans wouldn't have to cover those. Self-insured plans would have the option basically of choosing to cover some of that preventive care or not. And if they did choose to cover it, they would be free to impose cost sharing now, which they hadn't been able to do before. So if this is upheld, this is going to be appealed to the Fifth Circuit and almost certainly all the way up to the Supreme Court. So we expect that in the meantime, there's going to be a lot of uncertainty around what is and is not fully required under the preventive care mandate. What I think we would generally recommend is taking a fairly cautious, conservative approach and not running out and wildly altering your preventive care benefits based on this case, at least not yet. Let the dust kind of settle and we'll see kind of where it lands. But the one thing that I would always say, it takes me back to that old phrase. They say that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And it kind of cuts both ways. Like a pound of cure can be undermined by losing an ounce of prevention. So I think it's something that plans will have to consider, whether it's more worthwhile to continue covering preventive care and incentivizing their participants to utilize preventive care with either low or no cost sharing, because every bit of preventive care can save a plan more money down the line, because it will hopefully, ideally, prevent a participant from incurring a more serious, more expensive health concern down the line. So Corey, I threw a lot at you there. Do you have anything that you want to add though?
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned RFRA in there, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. Can you just speak to a little bit how that tied into this specific case? I know that it was mentioned before in Hobby Lobby, but how did they bring RFRA into
Right.
this, and how did the judge rule on that?
Right. So RFRA, that was a big part of the Hobby Lobby case, which was essentially an argument from plaintiffs that they didn't want to have to cover contraceptive care, which is its own whole separate can of worms under the Affordable Care Act. But it kind of built off of a similar argument and some of the precedent in the Hobby Lobby case to say that for these plaintiffs to argue that the requirement under preventive care to offer things like PrEP and PEP drugs, which are designed basically to protect people from HIV either before or after they're exposed to it. PrEP is before, PEP is after. They argued that that violated their religious opposition to homosexual activity, to intravenous drug use. They had a whole suite of issues basically that they saw them having to cover drugs to protect people from HIV as essentially helping facilitate their lifestyle, which would go against their religious beliefs. And the judge did find some merit in that, which factored into his ultimate decision, just like it did in the Hobby Lobby case before it.
Basically saying if I have to cover the drug, I'm tacitly approving of what led to the drug, and these activities are the most common that leads to this. And it
They
violates
would argue tacitly approving and facilitating, which you can take or leave. I tend to disagree, but I can kind of see where they're going.
Excellent. Well, I'll tell you one thing. Thank you for hanging on to the end, all of you out there listening, because we use as many acronyms as humanly possible in this episode of the Empowering Plans podcast. And Nick, to your credit, you navigated USPSTF flawlessly. Pat is not going to have to edit a single one of those. That was brilliant on your part and maneuvering through that. We appreciate you all taking time out of your day to listening to the Empowering Plans podcast. Hopefully you learned something along the way. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to FIA directly, and we will be happy to assist you in whatever question, whether or not it pertains to the ACA preventative care, the No Surprises Act, or a litany of other issues that plague our industry. We are here to help when you come to the hard topics and the hard content within this industry. So thank you all for joining us today, and until next time, this is Nick and Corey. Have a great day.